The bank's foreclosure notice was still nailed to her gatepost the morning Adeline Forsythe rode out to the high meadow and found 300 head of cattle. She did not own grazing peacefully on grass that should have been hers. A stranger's brand, a stranger's herd, and no stranger anywhere in sight to ask how they had come to save her. 8 months earlier, the Gunnison Valley lay brown under a thin October sky. Adeline stood at her husband's grave behind the barn, the wood marker already weathering gray. A body can't do everything alone, the preacher had told her at the burial. Pride's a poor companion through a hard winter. She had nodded and meant nothing by it. Alone was safer. Alone, no one could leave you, lie to you, or die on you in a fever and call it God's plan. The ranch ran itself badly without a second pair of hands, and Adeline knew it. The corral gate sagged on a busted hinge. The east fence had 3 rails down where elk had pushed through, and her cattle, 40 head, all she had left, drifted where they pleased. The woodpile, which her husband had always kept stacked shoulder high against the barn by September, held barely a week's worth of splits. Winter in the high country did not forgive a thin woodpile. She rose before light, mucked the barn, hauled water from the creek that ran cold off the Sawatch Peaks, and worked until her hands cracked at the knuckles. By dusk, she was too tired to cook proper and ate cold biscuits standing at the window, watching the road that came up from Leadville for riders who never had good news. The mercantile in town was run by a man named Hartwell, soft-spoken and patient as a spider. Her husband had carried a tab there, and the tab had not died with him. Hartwell sent word twice now, polite as church, reminding her the account stood at $81 and climbing with interest. He had a way of mentioning every visit, how a widow's ranch was a heavy thing to carry, and how he'd be glad to take it off her hands at a fair price. She knew what his fair price was. It was theft wearing a clean collar. The neighbors were kind in the way that cost them nothing. The Petersons brought a pie after the funeral. The Crowleys offered to buy her south quarter for less than the water on it was worth. Everyone agreed she could not manage. Everyone was a little eager to be proven right. What Adeline had was stubbornness and a rifle she kept clean and a deep, cold mistrust of any man who smiled at her with a plan behind his teeth. Her husband had been a good man, but good men died and left you the debts and the broken hinges and the long arithmetic of survival. Strangers were worse. Strangers off the road were thieves who hadn't gotten around to it yet. So when she rode into town that gray afternoon to plead one more month from Hartwell, she was not looking to hire anyone. She was looking to last. She had her whole life arranged around lasting, around needing no one, around the certainty that the only person who would not betray her was the one she saw in the cracked shaving mirror each dawn. He was sitting against the wall of the feed store with his hat over his knee, a tall man gone gaunt, his coat worn through at the elbows, Irish, by the look and the few words she caught as she passed. He was asking the blacksmith quietly whether any outfit needed a hand for board and $1 a day. The blacksmith laughed and turned away. Adeline almost passed him, too. Then she saw his hands. Big, scarred, steady hands, the kind that had done real work and weren't ashamed of it. And she thought of her woodpile, thin as a poor man's promise, and the snow that would come whether she was ready or not. "You split wood?" she heard herself ask. He looked up. His eyes were a tired gray-green, careful, giving nothing away. I can split wood, missus, among other things." "Just the wood," she said. "Don't get ideas." She regretted it before she'd ridden a mile home. What did she know about him? Nothing. A name, Declan Brannigan, and a thin frame and an accent that placed him a long way from anywhere he could be checked on. He'd follow her out to a ranch with no men on it, learn where she kept what little she had, and one moonless night he'd be gone with her horse and her grandmother's silver, and whatever else would fit in a saddlebag. She'd as good as invited a wolf to count her sheep. That first night she barred the door and lay awake listening. She'd put him in the bunkhouse, a single cold room off the barn, and given him an old blanket and 3 days' notice in her own mind. 3 days, And the first thing out of place, she'd send him down the road, at the point of a clean rifle. But the mistrust ran deeper than the fear, and that was the trouble. It wasn't only him. It was every man who'd ever made a promise across a table and broken it before the dishes were cleared. It was her father, who'd gambled the family farm in Ohio and vanished west. It was the cattle buyer who'd cheated her husband on their first drive. It was the doctor who'd taken $4 and told them the fever would pass. She had built a fortress, and the fortress had a single law carved over the gate. Expect to be betrayed, and you will never be surprised. Hadn't she been right every time? Every kindness had a hook in it. Every smile was a loan to be called. The preacher could talk about pride all he liked, but pride had kept the door barred and the rifle clean. And she was still here, wasn't she? Still on her own land. The Petersons pitied her. Hartwell wanted to swallow her whole. And now she'd handed a strange man the run of her place because he had honest-looking hands. Honest-looking, as if hands ever told the truth, as if anything did. She nearly went out to the bunkhouse that very night to tell him the job was off. Here's $1 for your trouble. Be gone by light. She got as far as the door with her hand on the bar. Then she heard it, through the cold, across the yard, the steady, patient sound of an axe. He was splitting wood in the dark, by feel and moonlight, because she'd said the pile was thin and winter was coming. Not waiting for morning, not waiting to be watched. She listened a long while. Then she went back to bed, and she did not sleep. But she did not send him away either. By morning, the woodpile had grown by half a cord, stacked square and tight the way her husband used to do it, the splits sized even for the stove. Declan was already at the creek, hauling the water she usually hauled, and he set the buckets by her door without a word and went back to the axe. She made coffee. After a long moment, she carried a second cup out across the frosted yard and held it out to him. He took it with a nod. Obliged. You stacked it like you've done it before. My father had a cottage in Galway, he said. Peat mostly, but wood the same. You stack it to breathe, or it rots from the heart out. She stayed. She watched him work. The friendship came slow, the way thaw comes to high country. A drip at a time, easy to miss. Declan spoke little, but what he said was true, and Adeline found herself, by the third evening, lingering at the bunkhouse door with the supper plate instead of leaving it on the step. He'd been a tenant farmer's son, he told her. Then a soldier he wouldn't talk about. Then a man who walked west because the walking was all that was left. He'd lost people too. He didn't say who. He didn't have to. She knew the particular quiet of someone carrying graves. It was the first thing they shared. What Adeline expected was a season of split wood and then an empty bunkhouse. What she got was a man who could not seem to stop fixing things. The corral gate went first. She came out the third morning to find the busted hinge gone and a new one in its place, forged crude but sound, the gate swinging true for the first time since spring. When she asked where the iron had come from, Declan showed her the broken plow blade he'd found rusting in the weeds behind the barn and the cold hammer marks where he'd worked it over a fire D built from his own woodpile. You're a blacksmith too now, she said. I'm a man who's been hungry, he answered. Hunger teaches you a great many trades. The east fence was next. He walked the whole line of it, all 3 miles, and came back with a tally in his head of every rail down and every post rotted at the base. Then he spent 4 days setting it right, splitting rails from a deadfall stand of lodgepole up the draw, tamping the posts deep with creek stone packed around them so the frost couldn't heave them loose. Her 40 head stopped drifting. She found them where she'd left them, which after a year of chasing strays felt very near to a miracle. He had a way with the animals that unsettled her. It was so gentle. The mean roan gelding her husband had never broken proper, the one that bit, took to following Declan around the corral like a dog. Adeline watched him stand for an hour with his hand flat against that horse's neck, saying nothing, until the animal dropped its head and breathed easy. He didn't break the horse. He waited until the horse decided to stop being broken. "Where'd you learn that?" she asked. "You don't learn it. You just stop being in a hurry." She began to find reasons to be wherever he was working. She told herself it was watchfulness. A smart woman kept an eye on a hired stranger. But the watching changed in its nature without her quite noticing. She watched the careful way he ate, like a man who remembered hunger and meant to respect food. She watched him take his hat off when she came near, every time the old courtesy worn smooth as a river stone. She watched him not look at the house when he thought she wasn't watching, not cataloging what was inside, not casing the place, just working. One evening she found him sitting on the bunkhouse step in the last light, mending the strap of her good harness, the one she'd thought ruined. He had an awl and waxed thread and a tongue between his teeth, stitching in the failing light. "That's a saddler's work," she said. I apprenticed to one for a season in Pennsylvania. Didn't suit me, the indoors of it. But the hands remember." He held the strap up to the light, turned it, found it good. "A man oughtn't waste a thing that can be mended. Too much gets thrown out in this country that only wanted a little patience." She thought he might have been talking about more than the harness, but she didn't ask. The days turned colder. The aspens went gold and then bare. He patched the barn roof where the snow would have come through. He cleaned and oiled tools she'd given up as rusted past saving. He dug out the spring box where her water came from and lined it with flat stones so the silt stopped clouding her drinking water. Every morning she expected to find him gone with something of hers. Every morning he was at the woodpile, breath smoking in the cold, the axe rising and falling in that steady rhythm that had become the clock of her days. She caught herself laughing once, actually laughing, when he tried to teach the roan to take a carrot from his hat, and the horse ate the hat instead. The sound of her own laugh startled her. She hadn't heard it in over a year. It had been buried out back with everything else. That night she sat longer than usual at the bunkhouse door. He'd made a small fire in the stove, and the light of it came orange through the cracked window. He was reading. She hadn't known he could. A worn book of poems he carried wrapped in oilcloth in his saddlebag, the only thing of value he seemed to own. "My mother's," he said, when he saw her looking. "It's the only Irish I have left. The rest I had to leave behind to fit through the door of this country." "Read me some," she said, surprising them both. And he did, in a low voice, the strange soft music of it filling the cold room, and, for the length of a poem, Adeline Forsyth forgot to be afraid. It was the matter of the debts that changed things in earnest. Adeline had been dreading the trip to Hartwell's Mercantile the way a body dreads a tooth pull. The $81 had climbed past 90 with the interest Hartwell charged, and she had perhaps $12 in the coffee tin and nothing else until the spring calves sold. She'd resigned herself to begging another extension and watching the man's patient smile widen as the noose did. Declan asked, one evening, plain as anything, what was troubling her. She'd not meant to tell him. It came out anyway. The tab, the interest, the way Hartwell circled her ranch like weather. He was quiet a while. Then he said, "Might I see the account?" She had the slips of paper Hartwell sent, the running tally in the merchant's neat hand. Declan spread them on the table by the lamp and went through them slow, his finger moving line by line, his lips shaping the figures. She'd not have guessed a drifter could cipher. He could, and well. "Here," he said at last, tapping a line. "And here, and down here as well." He looked up. "He's charged you the interest on the interest, Mrs. Compounding it monthly when your husband's agreement. You have the original?" "I'd wager," said Yearly. "And these three entries, 40 pounds of flour in August. Did you buy 40 pounds of flour in August?" She had not. She hadn't been to town in August at all. "It's an old trick," Declan said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a tired knowing. "Slip a charge onto a tab the customer can't dispute. A widow especially. Who's to say what her dead husband bought? I've seen it done to my own people, the company store back home. The figure's always wrong and always in the one direction." He squared the papers. "If you've the original agreement, and if these phantom charges can be struck, I'd put your true debt nearer $40 than 90, and 40 you can manage. She found the original. It was in her husband's trunk, folded in among his papers, and it said yearly plain as day. They rode to town together the next morning. Adeline had not intended to bring him, but he'd saddled the roan before she could object, and she found she did not want to face Hartwell alone after all. The merchant's smile cooled by several degrees when Declan walked in behind her and stood quiet by the counter, hat in his scarred hands. Adeline laid the original agreement on the counter and, in a voice that shook only a little at the start, and not at all by the end, named each false charge and each improper sum of interest and asked Mr. Hartwell to correct his books. Hartwell blustered. He spoke of a widow's confusion, of her late husband's well-known forgetfulness, of how these matters were complicated and best left to men who understood them. Declan said nothing. He only stepped forward and set one finger on the August flower entry and looked at Hartwell and waited. He had a way of waiting that was louder than most men's shouting. The merchant's eyes flicked to the door, to the street, to the other customers who had gone quiet and curious. A reputation in a small town was a fragile thing. To be caught cheating a widow with witnesses. There may have been, Hartwell said tightly, a clerical error or two. There were 11. They corrected them one by one, Declan reading the figures, Adeline writing them down so there could be no slipping back. When they finished, the true debt stood at $38.40. She paid him 12 against it, then and there, and walked out with her spine straight for the first time in a year. Outside, in the cold sunshine, she found she was trembling. You knew he'd back down, she said. I hoped. A bully's brave with a frightened woman and shy with a watching room. Declan settled his hat. You did the talking, missus. I only stood there. You did more than stand there. He shrugged it off, but she saw the small pleasure he took in it, quickly hidden, and she understood something about him then. He was a man who'd been made to feel worthless so long that being useful had become the only way he knew to be alive. He fixed things because fixed things were proof he was not nothing. She knew that disease. She had it herself. They rode home mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than the mornings. Somewhere on that cold road between town and ranch, without a word marking the moment, Adeline Forsyth stopped thinking of Declan Brannigan as a stranger she was watching and started thinking of him as the only person in the valley she trusted. It frightened her more than any wolf. First snow came that night, soft and serious, and in the morning the valley was white and silent and clean. Adeline stood on the porch with her coffee and watched Declan break a path to the barn, and she made a decision she'd been circling for a week. The bunkhouse stove smokes, she said when he came near. And it's a cold thing, eating alone. You'll take your supper at the house, at the table. She paused. If you want. He looked at her a long moment, snow gathering on the brim of his hat. I'd like that, he said, very much. That evening he sat at her husband's place at the table, and it did not feel like a ghost being replaced. It felt strangely like the house had been waiting to be full again. Hartwell was not a man who took a loss in front of a watching room and forgot it. Adeline noticed the change slowly. A coolness in town. The Crowleys, who'd always nodded, looked away. At the church social, before the heavy snows closed the roads, she heard the word before she saw who'd said it. Drifter, and then quieter words around. It and they were not about Declan's woodcutting. It was Mrs. Peterson, kind enough to be cruel by accident, who told her plain. People are saying things, Adeline, about you and that Irishman living out there. Alone, it's not my business, but a woman's good name, and nobody knows the first thing about him. Hartwell says he's likely wanted somewhere, says no honest man drifts. So that was the shape of it. Hartwell couldn't beat Declan over a ledger, so he'd go at him through the only thing a small town valued more than money, reputation. And go at Adeline through it too, because a ruined woman would be glad to sell cheap and leave. She rode home angry. She found Declan rechinking the barn wall against the cold, and she told him all of it, the talk and the looks and Hartwell's hand behind it. He took it quietly, the way he took everything, but she saw something move behind his eyes. An old fear, a thing he'd run from before. "I'll go, if it's hurting you," he said. "Say the word and I'll be down the road by morning. I'll not be the cause of your trouble. I didn't tell you so you'd leave." Then why? "Because I'm tired of facing his kind alone." She heard herself say it and didn't take it back. "Stay, let them talk. Talk never split a cord of wood." He stayed. But the trouble deepened. Hartwell denied his cheap purchase, began to call in what he was owed by others. And many in the valley owed him. A word here, a favor leaned on there. Adeline's small market for her beef and her eggs and her butter began to dry up, custom drifting to the merchant's friends. The man who'd always bought her surplus hay suddenly didn't need it. The freighter who'd hauled her goods to the rail at a fair rate raised his price, passed cents, then apologized, and she understood he'd been leaned on, too. A ranch is a web of small dependencies, and Hartwell knew every strand. He began patiently to cut them. Then came the worst of it. Word arrived, by way of a county notice tacked up at the very mercantile, that there was a lien being explored against the Forsyth water rights. The creek that ran off the Sawatch, the creek that was the whole worth of the ranch, that watered the cattle and filled the spring box and made the South Meadow grow. Someone had filed a claim that the original water grant was improperly recorded back in the territory days and that the rights might revert and be available for purchase. Hartwell, of course, would be glad to purchase them, for the good of the valley. Without water, the ranch was nothing, dust and a barn. He didn't need to take the land, he only needed to take the creek, and the land would fall into his hands like a dead apple. "He's found the one rock he can lever," Declan said, studying the notice she'd brought home. "Cut the water and he's cut the heart. Can he do it? Legally? I don't know the law of this country well enough." Declan's jaw was tight. "But I know a filing's only as good as the records behind it. If your grant was recorded proper, his claim's a bluff to scare you to the table. If it wasn't," he didn't finish. That night, Adeline went through her husband's trunk again, every paper by lamplight until past midnight. The deed was there. The brand registration was there. But the water grant, the one document that mattered most, she could not find. Not in the trunk, not in the strong box, not anywhere. It was gone. And without it, Hartwell's bluff was no bluff at all. She sat on the floor in the lamplight, surrounded by her dead husband's papers, and felt the fortress walls she'd built her whole life beginning, at last, to come down, not from the outside, but from within. Declan did not despair the way she did. He had been poor too long to mistake a hard turn for the end. While Adeline sat up nights doing the arithmetic of ruin, he was thinking, and on the third morning he laid out what he'd been thinking. "The grant was recorded," he said. "It must have been, or you couldn't have held the water these years without a fight. The paper in your husband's trunk was only your copy. The true record's in the county seat, in the recorder's books, in Gunnison Town. If we can find the entry, the date, the book and page, then it doesn't matter that your copy's lost. The county's own ledger proves the grant, and Hartwell's claim falls apart. And if the entry's gone, if he's already, then we'll know that too and know what we're fighting." He pulled on his coat. "Better to ride than to sit. The snow'll only get deeper. I'll go to Gunnison. We'll go to Gunnison." It was 40 miles over a pass that the early snows had half closed, and they made it in 2 hard days, sleeping one bitter night in a line shack with the roan and her mare crowded in close for the warmth. Adeline had never ridden so far in winter. Her hands went numb on the reins, but Declan rode steady beside her, breaking trail where the drifts ran deep, and never once complained, and she thought she had never in her life been so cold or felt so oddly safe. The Gunnison recorder was an old man with ink-stained fingers and an honest face, and he was, thank God, no friend of Hartwell's. When Adeline explained her trouble, he frowned and pulled the great leather-bound books for the territory years and set them on the table, and they began to search. It took the better part of 2 days. The old recorder turned page after brittle page, his finger trailing the cramped entries. while the snow fell soft against the window, and Adeline's hope rose and sank with each turned leaf. And then Declan, leaning over a second volume the recorder had let him search, went still. "Here," he said softly. "Here it is. It was there. The water grant, recorded proper in the spring of 1871, Book 4, page 209, the creek named, the acreage named, her husband's name in the territory clerk's own hand. Witnessed, stamped, beyond any dispute. The recorder made them a certified copy, 3 of them, sealed and signed, and would take no payment but charged it instead, with a dry smile, as a public duty. There's a deal too much of this lately," he said. "Men filing paper claims on water that's been honestly held 20 years, hoping the holder hasn't the means to fight. You're not the first to come over that pass half-froze. You may be the first to leave with what you came for." They rode home with the sealed copies wrapped in Declan's oilcloth, next to his mother's book of poems, and Adeline felt the fortress that had begun to crumble setting back up stone by stone, but different now. Not a fortress against everyone. A house with one door she'd left open on purpose. But Hartwell had not been idle either. They came down off the pass to find new trouble waiting. A letter from a lawyer in Leadville, hired by Hartwell, stating that the disputed water rights matter would be heard before the county at the end of the month and that interested parties were invited to present their claims. And worse, a notice that in the interim, pending resolution, the contested water was to be considered in abeyance, and that the Forsyth Ranch was not to draw upon the creek beyond household need until the matter was settled. In winter, with the cattle needing water, that was a slow strangling dressed up in legal clothes. Hartwell had bought himself weeks of pressure, betting she'd crack before the hearing. And then, 4 nights before the hearing, came the blow that nearly finished her. She woke to the roan screaming in the barn and the smell of smoke. The haystack, her whole winter's feed for 40 head, was burning, set alight at the windward corner, where a careless spark could be blamed, but no. Honest spark had reached. By the time they'd beaten it out, soot-black and shaking in the snow, half the hay was gone. In the gray dawn, they stood in the trampled, smoking snow and counted the cost. Half the hay gone. The creek under legal lock. The cattle she could not feed and could not water, lowing miserable in the cold. 4 days to a hearing she might win and still lose, because winning a water right does no good to cattle already dead. Declan's face was streaked black. His hands burned at the knuckles where he'd pulled flaming bales clear. "I can't feed them," Adeline said. Her voice was flat and far away. "I can't water them. I win the paper and lose the herd, and a ranch with no herd is just a place to starve slower." She looked at the smoking ruin. "He's beaten me. He was always going to." She went into the house and sat at the cold table and did not light the lamp. This was the thing she had always known would come. This was why she'd kept the door barred and the rifle clean and her heart in a box with the lid shut. You let yourself need a place, need a herd, need a person, and the world found the soft spot and pressed until you broke. Her husband had needed her and then died and left her this. Her father had needed his luck and gambled them all to ruin. Need was the wound. She'd known it her whole life, and for one foolish autumn she'd let herself forget. She could sell to Hartwell tomorrow for whatever pittance he offered, and at least the cattle wouldn't starve under her watch. She could take the few dollars and the disgrace and go. Back east, anywhere, somewhere that didn't know her. Start again as nothing, which was what she'd been before, which was what she truly was. And Declan would move on. Down the road with his book of poems and his scarred hands to the next outfit that needed a season's mending. He'd be all right. His kind always were. They didn't put down roots, so they couldn't be torn up by them. She heard the door and his step, and felt him stand in the dark behind her. "I should have sold last spring," she said to the cold window, "before I had anything left to lose, before I had anyone." "You've not lost me," Declan said, "and you've not lost the herd, not yet." She turned in the dark. "The neighbors," he said, "the Petersons, the men Hartwell's leaned on. They've no love for him. They're afraid of him, that's all, each one alone. But fear breaks when men stand together. I learned that much in places I won't name. You've a true water grant in my saddlebag and a herd that needs feed for 4 days. Ask them. Not as a widow begging, as a neighbor who's about to win, calling in plain decency. He held out his burned, steady hand. You don't have to do it alone. That was never the rule. She rode out at first light to every ranch in the valley, and she did not go as the pitied widow Forsyth. She went as a woman with certified county records in her saddlebag and a wrong done to her plain for anyone to see. She started with the Petersons, because Mrs. Peterson's tongue ran loose, and that for once could serve. Adeline laid the sealed copy of the water grant on their kitchen table and told the whole of it. The false charges struck from Hartwell's books, the phantom water claim built on a bluff, the lawyer's lock on her creek, and the haystack burned in the night by no honest spark. She did not weep and she did not beg. She told it flat and true and let it land. He cheated me on the ledger and got caught, she said. So now he's burning feed and locking water. And if it works on me, it works on any of you next time he wants your land cheap. I need hay to carry 40 head 4 days to the hearing. I'll pay it back at shearing, with interest fairer than Hartwell ever charged. And I need men at that hearing, not to fight, just to stand in the room and be counted, so the county sees this valley's watching, mister. Peterson looked at the grant a long while. He was a cautious man, and Hartwell held a note on his north field. She knew the weight of what she asked. He's leaned on me too, Peterson admitted. Made me drop your hay cust. I felt low about it. He looked at his wife, who for once said nothing, only nodded. I've a stack to spare. You'll have it today. One yes is a crack in a dam. She rode to the Crowleys, who'd tried to buy her south quarter cheap, and had the grace to look ashamed now, and they gave hay and a wagon to haul it. She rode to the freighter who'd raised his rates under pressure, and he not only dropped them but offered his team. She rode to 4 more outfits, and at each one the story did its quiet work because every small rancher in that valley had felt the soft press of Hartwell's patient hand and had been waiting without knowing it for someone to stand up first so they wouldn't have to stand alone. By dusk, wagons of hay were rolling up the Forsyth Road. The cattle ate. And as for the water, Declan had thought of that too. He's locked the creek, Declan said, but he's not locked the snow. Through those 4 days, the men of 3 ranches hauled and melted snow in every kettle and trough and tub the valley could spare, and they hauled water in barrels from the Peterson well, which sat on land no claim touched. It was brutal, freezing labor, and they did it together, and the cattle drank, and not one head was lost. Hartwell's slow strangling failed because he'd never reckoned on a valley deciding all at once to breathe as one body. The hearing was held in the Gunnison County Courthouse on a hard, bright morning, the snow squeaking underfoot, and the room was full. Adeline had expected to face Hartwell and his Leadville lawyer alone across a cold table. Instead, the benches behind her were crowded. The Petersons, the Crowleys, the freighter, ranchers from up and down the valley, the old recorder himself come to speak to his own books. Hartwell, arriving with his lawyer and his patient smile, stopped in the doorway when he saw the room, and the smile faltered for the first time since Adeline had known him. The lawyer made his case smooth as oil. The original grant improperly recorded, the rights reverted. His client merely seeking to clear a clouded title for the public good. Then the old recorder rose and set his great leather book on the table and opened it to Book 4, page 209. He read the entry aloud in his dry, careful voice. The date, the creek, the acreage, the witnesses, the territory clerk's own hand. He laid the certified copies beside it. He stated, as the keeper of the county's records, that the grant of 1871 was properly recorded, lawfully witnessed, and beyond any honest dispute, and that he could not imagine what records the gentleman from Leadville had consulted, as they were certainly not the county's. The room murmured. The lawyer's smooth face went stiff. Adeline stood then. She did not raise her voice. She laid out the matter of the mercantile ledger. The 11 false charges, corrected before witnesses last autumn. She laid out the convenient timing of the water claim, filed within weeks of Hartwell's failure to cheat her by the tab. She let the county make the arithmetic itself. A man who'd cheat on a ledger, caught, turning next to a paper claim on a 20-year water right. She did not mention the burned hay because she could not prove it, but she did not need to. The shape of the man was plain in the room now, drawn by his own hand. The county officer hearing the matter did not take long. The water grant of 1871 stood, fully and finally confirmed. The lien claim was dismissed as without foundation. The abeyance order on the creek was struck, and the officer added, looking over his spectacles at the Leadville lawyer, that he would take a dim view of any further such claims brought before him on records that did not exist, and that the gentleman might convey as much to his client. It was as close to a public stripping as a court ever gave a man like Hartwell. He left the courthouse without his smile, and within the year, finding the valley grown cold to him in a way no leaning could fix, he sold the mercantile and went elsewhere to be patient at strangers. Outside in the bright cold, the valley folk gathered around Adeline, and there was a warmth in it she had not felt since before the funeral, not pity now, but respect, and something like belonging. She had ridden in alone every day of her life. She rode home that afternoon in the middle of a string of wagons, with Declan beside her on the roan, and the talk and laughter of neighbors carrying across the snow. "You did the talking again," Declan said. "I only stood there." "You're a liar." "Declan Brannigan," she said, and she was smiling. "And the only honest man I know." The following autumn, the woodpile stood shoulder high against the barn by the 1st of September, stacked square and tight, sized even for the stove, the way it was meant to be. Adeline stood on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and watched the high meadow, where 300 head grazed on good grass. Her brand now, bought with a fair loan from neighbors who'd learned that lending could be a kindness instead of a noose. Declan came up from the creek with the morning water and set the buckets by the door and took the coffee she held out, and they stood together looking at the herd and the mended fences and the valley that had finally let her belong to it. "A body can't do everything alone," she said. "No," he agreed. "Thank God."